Good evening, and welcome to the Leadership Institute's live lecture. I'm your host, Patricia Simpson, Director of Political and Online Training here at the Leadership Institute. On tonight's webinar, our guest is Matthew Hurt, conservative columnist, fundraiser, and former campaign manager, who will discuss building your volunteer army. Matt, thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, we are going to be talking about volunteers. I know that money is really important to campaigns, but just how important are volunteers to a campaign?
Sure. Particularly for conservative grassroots campaigns is very important. And what we'll talk about tonight is just how important volunteers are and how to bring them into your campaign and harness their energy to propel your campaign across the finish line on election day. So the importance of volunteers, certainly, they're the heart and soul of your campaign. Any grassroots organization, particularly a conservative campaign, runs off volunteer work. You as a candidate or a campaign manager are not multipliable. The more volunteers you have, the more time you have to reach voters or advance your cause. And these volunteers motivate other people to act. They bring people into your campaign or into your cause and help you propel yourself across the finish line. And they certainly define your campaign's identity. There are three types of volunteers. There's your 3 a.m. type, somebody like me who will wake up at 3 a.m. when the campaign calls and do anything that the candidate needs within legal realms. Then you have your closet cases, and I'll be able to talk about those here in a little bit. They're the folks who you don't necessarily put in front of potential voters or petition signers or these types of folks. And then you have your James Bond volunteers. And these are the folks who love to do covert campaign operations, again, certainly within the realm of legality. And you need people who are passionately crazy about your campaign. And what I love about working on conservative campaigns is oftentimes we can draw volunteers from very unique sources, and we'll talk about those here in just a bit. So the way you recruit volunteers for your campaign is you can search your stakeholder list. People who have donated to your campaign before, people who are interested in your cause, or people who know your candidate. Your special interest and support groups as well. Conservative campaigns often harness the energy of homeschool communities, and pro-life communities are just two examples. Friends and family. I know in the last campaign I worked on, we used the candidates' children extensively on the campaign to seal envelopes, stuff envelopes, and do other things. Other business and civic organizations. If you're running a conservative campaign, you might in fact be endorsed by business communities or folks in the business community. You can harness that energy. Former campaigns, if your candidate is an incumbent, it's certainly easier to draw volunteers. Or if you've worked on campaigns yourself, you can bring the volunteers from one campaign and use their efforts and their energy on another campaign. But you need to understand your volunteers and create a profile about them. Understand their motivations and why they're getting involved. You may even find some volunteers who have previous experience with campaigns. I know in the last campaign I worked on, we had a number of volunteers who were actual assistant volunteer coordinators who had worked on a number of campaigns in the past. And we were able to use their leadership and volunteer experience to sort of corral the other volunteers. And also issue and philosophical groups. On the right, we have pro-life organizations, homeschool communities, and other groups that really love to get involved, knock on doors, and make phone calls. I strongly encourage you to reach out to these groups throughout the campaign if you can, and if a network exists in your area. Obviously, you want to hunt where the ducks are. Look for places where volunteers associate and get together. Where are these folks? Family and friends, local political parties, colleagues, church groups, community events, youth groups, and even unsolicited volunteers. I know if the town you're running in has a college in it, you'll have enthusiastic college Republicans or college Democrats, depending upon the race, who are looking for opportunities to get involved. Also, young Republicans and young Democrats and other organizations like those who are willing to get involved and meet the candidate and knock on doors and volunteer. The key to recruitment, though, is you have to ask. A list of volunteers is a potential list of volunteers. Unless you call through and connect with each of those potential volunteers, you don't know if they're going to come out and support your campaign, and they certainly need to be asked. I know when I was working on the previous campaign in 2010, we would call through our volunteer list regularly and connect with volunteers. Folks who came in on a regular basis, folks who only came in once or twice a month, and others, we made sure that we knew their schedule and we connected with them. You can also recruit online. Facebook, Twitter, blogs, and LinkedIn are excellent resources, particularly Twitter and Facebook. More and more folks are engaging and being energized in social media.
Now, Matt.
Sure.
I've got a couple questions from some people. One of them, going back to talking about volunteers and what they do. What happens if a volunteer does something illegal?
I usually have a rule, never fire volunteers. However, there are extenuating circumstances. What you don't want to do is be in a situation where your campaign or your petition drive is compromised by the actions of a volunteer or even a paid staffer. Certainly, if it's something illegal, the Leadership Institute and the campaigns that I've worked on have never, ever advocated that anyone do anything illegal on a campaign. And so if that happens, you want to neutralize that as quickly as possible. Certainly don't want to cause an issue for the campaign. And that's one of the things that going into a campaign, myself as oftentimes a paid staffer or sometimes a volunteer, I know that it's not my job to be on the front page of the newspaper. It's my job to support a candidate or to support a petition or something. And if I jeopardize that, it really looks bad on me. So I would certainly encourage volunteers to operate within the realm of legality.
And then you talked a lot about places to find volunteers. Are there any creative outside-the-box places that you thought of when you were running campaigns in the past to find volunteers?
You know, we had two very fantastic families in the last campaign in 2010, two homeschool families, and they each had 6 children apiece, from ages 5 all the way to age 18. And I really stress the importance and the enthusiasm of the 5- and 6-year-old, one boy and one girl, who loved working on the campaign. And they would stay in the campaign office as long as their mother stayed in, and stuff envelopes, and the boy even made phone calls, which was exciting. So certainly for conservative campaigns, reaching out to homeschool communities, I think, is one of the most important and influential things you can do. They love to help out with traditionally conservative candidates, and oftentimes they can get credit for it through their homeschool community. So yeah, that's really homeschoolers are my favorite source of volunteers.
And just one follow-up to that, and to let you be able to take a sip of water, because I know that it gets tough when you're talking a long time up here. Where does one get in contact with homeschool communities? If you're not a part of the homeschooling community, how do you get in contact with them?
Sure. If you're not involved in the homeschool community, it can be very difficult. Oftentimes the mother is sort of the protective grizzly of the homeschool family. There are places like Generation Joshua and Teen Pact and other organizations that recruit and sort of expand the horizons of young homeschoolers. In fact, many of them use the Leadership Institute here to sort of get plugged into the conservative movement. So I would say Generation Joshua and Teen Pact and others, but the most important figure in the homeschool community certainly is the mother. You want to make sure that you're on solid ground and good terms with her, because she's sort of the access. And oftentimes in communities there are a number of families, 4 or 5 or a dozen or so families, and there will be one mom who sort of takes initiative. And so you'll want to reach out to her, and if your candidate is traditionally conservative, they will oftentimes be willing to get involved in your campaign. So now we're going to talk about how to motivate those volunteers. You've reached out to them in the community. You've found a crop of homeschool families or some willing college Republicans or college Democrats. Now, how do you motivate them? One thing that on the last campaign we did was we provided them with internal campaign communications to make them feel like they were special and they were receiving priority information from the campaign. And this is something as simple as a campaign update or an email or an invitation to meet with a candidate. But it makes volunteers feel like they are an integral part of the campaign. Volunteer briefing sessions. Once a week, we had our campaign meetings in an open space, and we invited and encouraged volunteers to attend. And so they got to see sort of the backside of the campaign, what happens when, when the poll numbers look rough or when the poll numbers look good, what happens when you're going to roll out a TV commercial or the next round of mail pieces. And so really engaging them and getting them involved can really help. And they'll be motivated and encouraged to keep coming back. Oftentimes, also, the volunteers want to be in a paid position on a campaign. And so providing them with that behind-the-scenes look gives them a leg up when leaving your campaign and going to work for someone later. Also, candidate visits. My former boss in 2010 was excellent about sitting around with volunteers while he was signing thank you notes and just talking to them and understanding their motivations. People volunteer for different reasons, and understanding those motivations, particularly as the candidate, can really allow a connection between the candidate and the volunteer. Also, you want to catalog and take advantage of resources your volunteers have to offer. If someone is particularly good at phone calls and they're comfortable on the phone, they want a phone bank. If someone is particularly good at going door to door, you'll make sure that they're doing door to door. You don't want to connect your volunteer with a skill set that they are unfamiliar with or uncomfortable with. One thing that I do want to say is back to the point where I never fire volunteers. We had 2 volunteers on my last campaign in 2010 where they were high functioning, but they had a set of physical disabilities. And rather than turn them away, we welcomed them into the campaign. And one individual just once a week needed interaction with other volunteers. And so he was able to stuff envelopes and connect with our other volunteers. And the other young man was particularly good at lit drops. And in fact, most Saturday afternoons, he would lit drop for local churches. And they would pay him to go door to door and just drop literature at folks' doors. So we found out that he could lit drop an entire neighborhood in just an hour or 2. So we were able to plug him into the campaign that way. So when volunteers are treated the right way and they feel a sense of ownership of their responsibilities and they're connected to the campaign, they're going to become activists and stay involved in your campaign. They'll also become leaders, and later on down the road, they'll get involved in other campaigns or petition drives, and it's really a fascinating thing to see a volunteer come in, wet behind the ears, new to the campaign process, and to get them involved and see them grow throughout the course of a campaign. To motivate your volunteers, first you have to know them. You have to understand what motivates them. Most importantly, you have to know their names. My former boss was excellent at knowing a volunteer's name. First and last name, he knew their parents' names, he knew what school they went to, he knew what their interests were. You have to understand their goals and motivations. Why is someone volunteering? Do they want school credit? Do they want to one day be a candidate? Do they want FaceTime with your candidate? There are a number of motivations, and understanding those really allows you to connect with your volunteer and keep them engaged and keep them involved. You always want to follow up, don't check up. Be genuinely interested in the progress of a particular task that you've assigned a volunteer. If they're supposed to call a call sheet of 100 names or 200 names, connect with them and say, hey, have you done this? Have you completed this task? How's it going? Seem genuinely interested, and you should be genuinely interested in the success of your volunteers. If it looks like they're going to come up short or they're not going to succeed or cross that finish line, you can help them by assigning someone to help them with the task. But always be very kind and understanding. Volunteers are giving up their time where they could be oftentimes studying for school, going to church, or involved in other civic organizations. They're giving you their time for free. And so you must understand that, one, you shouldn't waste their time, and two, you should connect them with a task that they're comfortable doing. You could publicly thank them. This is something that my boss was particularly good at in the last campaign. He sent every volunteer a personal message, and he said, thank you so much for stuffing 500 envelopes, or for making 200 phone calls, or thank you so much for knocking on 50 doors. You've done an excellent job. Thank you. At our campaign events and meetings, he would publicly thank them. And it gives someone a sense of pride. And this isn't just for campaigns. This is in real life too. People want acknowledgement for their successes. And one thing that I was interested in early on are letters of recommendation. If I want to get a job on that next campaign, or maybe I want to get into the good college, I volunteer on a campaign, and at the end of the campaign, the candidate or the campaign manager provides a letter of recommendation. Myself, Matthew, was excellent on the phones and was a committed volunteer. He came in 15 hours a week and did a great job. Stuff like that really resonates and makes the volunteer feel important. And always provide refreshments. The two homeschool families I referenced previously would stay in the office until 11 p.m. most weeknights, so long as they had a steady supply of pizza and sweet tea. And so we could keep them around for as long as we needed, so long as we fed them. You should always have snacks or refreshments or something in the office so that volunteers, you don't know if they've had something beforehand or if they're going to dinner afterwards. So make sure that they're well fed. A well-fed volunteer is a happy volunteer. Then we're going to talk about managing those volunteers. You've got them in, they're motivated, they're excited about the campaign, and sometimes they get a little too excited. So you want to be able to keep them on task and keep them focused while advancing your cause in your campaign. There's absolutely no limit to the number of activities that a volunteer can take part in. From door-to-door, sign waving, phone banking, lit drops. On a campaign, there's an infinite number of possibilities and ways to plug volunteers in. So you need someone who is going to organize those volunteers to make volunteering a rewarding and enjoyable experience. As I said previously, you don't want to waste a volunteer's time. If someone comes into your campaign headquarters or your petition drive and you say, "Oh, I'm sorry, we don't have anything for you today," it's a tremendous waste of time for those volunteers. So you always want to have something for them to do, some way to plug them in. And always keep in mind your volunteer's experience. Some people, it's their first time on a campaign. Some people are veteran campaign volunteers. One lady in particular named Mary, she was probably in her 70s, and she had worked on a number of campaigns before in the 2010 cycle. And she was excellent at personal visits when our candidate couldn't make it, personal visits to older voters. And so, we would send her out to the nursing homes or to these gated communities where senior citizens live, and she was a hit. And she loved doing it. She loved connecting with older voters. So we made sure that she did that any opportunity she got. You want to be able to take the time to give your volunteer explicit directions. Because of the level of experience of volunteers, some folks aren't comfortable on the phone, or they don't know how to phone bank, or maybe they're not sure what to say when they get to the doors, when they're going door to door, or maybe they're not sure what to do if they get a compromising looking salute when they're sign waving. They have to understand the process, and it's your job or your volunteer coordinator's job to explain that to them. Maybe do a mock door-to-door experience where your volunteer knocks on your office door and you do the back and forth, and maybe you ask them a few questions about the candidate so they understand the candidate and the message and the experience. Always give titles to your volunteers. We had this one kid in 2010 who, during the primary, he phone banked, and he was really good at phone banking. So after the primary, we made him the phone bank volunteer coordinator. So volunteers would come through him to get their call lists, and they would talk to him, and he organized the entire thing. And by the end of the campaign, he had made somewhere around 10,000 phone calls himself and the volunteers he operated with. It also gives them a sense of importance. You know, anybody on a campaign can have a title. Titles are free. And so if you've got a volunteer who loves envelope stuffing, that volunteer can be Chief Envelope Stuffer. I mean, there's no shortage of campaign titles. But what you want to do when you're giving a speech to a group or going door to door for your volunteers, make sure you have sign-up cards to recruit potential volunteers. When we found, my candidate was fantastic, when we found a supporter at the door, we would ask them, you know, 1, would you like a yard sign? 2, do you have any children who are between the ages of 14 and 18 who would like to volunteer on the campaign? So we'd give them sign-up cards and get them engaged that way. You also want to collect business cards. My former boss was excellent at this, and he had been in office for a number of years and had business cards from all the way back from the beginning of his time in office. And so he could go back through these, through the Rolodex and call these individuals and get them involved in the campaign. You make sure that your volunteers have specific assignments. You don't just have a volunteer come into the office and say, oh, you know, find something to do. We've got plenty going on. Say, you know, today we'll be doing phone banking. Appreciate you here. Tomorrow we're going to go door to door. If you'd like to do that, you can join us. But make sure you have very specific assignments. And always remember that you can shoot us a question live at leadershipinstitute.org. And we're taking those questions live today. Patty, do we have any questions?
We do actually. There's someone who's asking, you're speaking a lot to how your former boss, when he was running for office, got to know all of the volunteers. What happens if you're working on a larger race where the candidate isn't necessarily around that much? How do you still develop a personal relationship between the candidate and the volunteers, or at least let the volunteers know that they're appreciated?
Sure. On a larger campaign, a congressional race or a U.S. Senate race or even a presidential campaign, you're going to have significantly limited contact with the candidate. You may see the candidate once a week. I know in January 2010, I went to volunteer for Scott Brown in Massachusetts in the special election. And so I rarely interacted with Scott. But on a number of occasions, he would come into the office and meet all the volunteers. And it was an interesting dynamic in that race where the activists on that side knew what was going to happen on election day. So they were very fired up. But he would come in about once a week and meet with volunteers and just talk to them briefly. But if you can't bring your candidate in, other members of the campaign staff, the campaign manager, certainly the volunteer coordinator, and using those other opportunities I described, like providing personal notes and thanking them publicly, or even in a campaign update or email blast, can really help motivate and make sure your volunteer understands that he or she is an integral part of the campaign.
And someone has asked, please explain more about the closet case type of volunteer, because I think that they're a little unclear exactly what you mean. Do you have any stories or examples?
Sure. And I really like to, there's a thin line when describing closet cases. Closet cases are individuals who may be abrasive. You may not want them meeting a potential voter. They may smell funny. They may, may not have the best hygiene. They may not have the best personal skills. And people, it could potentially turn off a potential voter if one of these individuals interacted with them at the door. As someone who is connected with the grassroots, one of the jokes that the Leadership Institute uses in some of its other trainings is it's that Pat Buchanan sort of volunteer who comes down from the woods and they've got the scruffy beard and they go door to door, and it's sort of a turnoff to voters. You definitely don't want to put those folks in front of potential voters. But there's an innumerable list of things they can still do on a campaign. Like I said, I would consider the two young men on the last campaign closet cases. However, I understood their motivation. I understood what they could do and what they did do very well, and I was able to channel their energy into those things. The one individual who went door to door ended up, he met somebody outside their home. They were watering their garden or something, and he started proselytizing to them a totally unrelated message. And thankfully, the individual he connected with was a campaign supporter. So that individual immediately called our campaign and said, you know, you have a young man here who is wildly off message. Make sure the next time he goes door to door or does a lit drop that he understands, you know, what the campaign is trying to do. But certainly, I would say that those folks have they have a skill set, and you should never fire someone. That's one of the things that I learned on the last campaign. There's, you know, you're always needing more volunteers. So why, outside of extenuating circumstances, in the case that they potentially break the law, why would you fire someone who is giving their time freely to your campaign?
Just to follow up on that, what happens if a volunteer that's a closet case is also happens to be a donor of yours? How do you handle that? Because there are some very odd individuals out there, and some of them have money that they like to give to campaigns. How do you make them still feel special?
More often than not, it will be the donor's children, potentially, who want to get involved in the campaign. A lot of the times, in my personal experience, donors are motivated by access to the candidate. So they don't necessarily want to volunteer, but in the case that they do, you know, they understand what it's like to give to a campaign. So you can have them write thank you notes to other donors. You know, have them connect in the office. You know, oftentimes, in my experience, for these donors, potential donors who've given to a campaign, they don't necessarily want to be in front of other voters. So I haven't seen that happen in my experience. However, you know, if it does, like I said, there are an infinite number of ways to get individuals involved and to make them feel motivated and special on a campaign. So just find a skill set that suits them is what I would encourage you to do. So now we're going to talk about 10 ways to ensure volunteers return to your campaign. They've come into your office, they've maybe sealed 100 envelopes, or they've made 25 phone calls, or they've gone door to door. Now, how do you get them to come back? It's that initial meeting with the campaign or the candidate, or that initial volunteer experience that's going to set the tone for the rest of their experience. If someone was rude to them, or if they felt as if they weren't important, they probably won't come back. If there are competing personalities, as oftentimes there are, they won't want to interact with other individuals. You have to understand not only the motivations of your individual volunteers, but how they connect with one another in the office. So the first thing is make sure they receive a reward for their work. It can be as simple as just having pizza, you know, in the office around lunchtime and dinner time. It could be personal visits with the candidate, dinner with the candidate, you know, important visits with other members of the campaign staff. As a campaign manager in 2010, I made sure that I always interacted with our volunteers. I always understood, you know, why they were there and what they wanted to get out of the experience. You want to make the place as comfortable as possible. A lot of volunteers, particularly for conservatives, when I'm talking about these homeschool communities, you know, it's a different tone, a different atmosphere in a campaign office than perhaps in the home of homeschool families. And so you want to make sure that you understand that certain topics of discussion, certain language, and other things that would make someone feel uncomfortable isn't right in a campaign office. You should keep it G-rated always. I know in the heat of a campaign, passions can sort of drive people, but we always kept our heated conversations out from in front of our volunteers all the time. You know, make sure that the volunteers sort of exude this excitement and this win psychology, and they're not hearing the negativity in the background, because it can be a demotivational factor for them. And they should always have a supervisor. You know, as a campaign manager in 2010, I didn't always have an opportunity to make sure all the volunteers were doing what they wanted to do or what they were supposed to be doing. So we had a volunteer coordinator, sort of like the mom of the office, who called through the lists, who made sure everyone had their tasks assigned to them, and who made sure everyone was doing their job. She was a very friendly woman and really connected with our volunteers. And so it made the experience better. You know, you weren't just making phone calls, you were making phone calls and interacting with other pleasant folks in the office. you want to take special care of your volunteers. Like I've said before, encouraging them or publicly acknowledging their contribution to your campaign is a fantastic way to keep them coming back. You also want to make volunteers feel sure they're part of the team. Ask their opinions and ask for their input. We had a number of volunteers who were more interested in sort of the campaign strategy and how to direct the campaign. So we would bring them into strategy meetings. What neighborhood do you think we should go to next? Which precinct is most important? Looking at the turnout models of the last two campaigns. Should we knock on undecided voters, or should we reach out to casual presidential election voters? What should our strategy be? And it's really interesting, particularly with younger volunteers, what their input is. And a hardened, battle-tested veteran of a campaign may not be able to see unique approaches to the campaign that a new fresh face would. So really encourage you to reach out to volunteers and ask their opinion.
Morton Blackwell, who's the president and founder of the Leadership Institute, has his laws of public policy process. And what's rule number 1? Give them a title and get them involved. How practical is it to give every single volunteer a title?
It depends on the campaign. It depends on the level of involvement. Like I said, we had a young man who, through the primary, just phone banked, and he was so good at it that after the primary, we made him the phone bank coordinator. We've had people who chief envelope stuffer. Of course, the 5 and 6 year old who were on the last campaign just loved the experience. So we were able to just make up wild, insane titles for them. One boy loved to empty the trash cans, and it's silly, but he knew he was helping out in the campaign. It was a small task. It was something that he could do, and he loved it. So for a while, we called him the trash man, and it was funny on the campaign. He loved it, and there was never a full trash bag in our office. He was great about taking out the trash. It was just fantastic to see him get excited about such, what you might consider a mundane task, but he was really excited about it. You also want to make ample use of thank you notes and volunteer newsletters. All the candidates I've ever worked for have been solid on writing thank you notes. Dear Matt, dear Patty, I really want to express my appreciation for the 15 hours you worked on the campaign this week. I really value your time. I know you're studying for that AP history test, or I know you're trying to get college credit, or I know you've got other obligations. You've got church or baseball or whatever it happens to be, but you've taken time out of your schedule to help us with this campaign, and that means a lot. And something as simple as that, a simple thank you note, really can connect and make a volunteer feel particularly important.
We've got another question. This is from Andrew, and his question is, how long before a campaign kicks off should you start building a group of volunteers?
If you know you're going to run for office, you should have a network of potential volunteers ready to go. If it's a local campaign, you're not going to draw as many volunteers out as if it were a congressional campaign or a Senate campaign or even a presidential campaign, where people are more drawn to the name of the individual or the understanding of access to that title. If you're running for dog catcher in Lewisburg, Tennessee, the people you're probably going to be working with are your cousins, your siblings, or people like that. But if you're a larger campaign, volunteers sometimes generally just are attracted to that campaign, so they'll get involved. It depends on the size of the campaign and the level of interest, but certainly you want to have volunteers early and continue to grow your volunteer list. Which leads me to this next point: always stay in contact with all your volunteers. We had our volunteer coordinator who once a week would call through the entire list of 80 or 90 volunteers and say, when can I get you in the office? When can I get you to do door-to-door? What's your schedule like this week? How are you on Tuesday? And at the end of the campaign, we had developed a pretty sophisticated schedule which we posted on the wall so that volunteers knew when they were supposed to come in. They knew who else was going to be in the office with them. And they would sign up themselves eventually. They would just sign onto the sheet and get involved in the campaign that way. But regular contact with volunteers, because they are so busy, because everyone is balancing their family life and their school life and all these things, it really is important to stay in contact with those volunteers. You also don't want to become impatient with inexperienced volunteers. So someone's not good on the phones the first time. You're able to work with them without getting flustered or without getting rude. This is an unwanted exchange between a volunteer and a campaign staffer. If they don't operate or they don't live up to your expectations, you have to understand maybe they don't have the experience. Maybe they should do something else, or maybe they just need more coaching. But also, you want to make it possible that the candidate has a lot of contact with your volunteers as well. Like I said on the last campaign, our candidate was in often. In a larger race, it's more difficult, yes, but they can connect with the office coordinator or the volunteer coordinator, just someone with a title who's a paid staffer who can reach out to them and connect with them on a personal level. It's important to have that personal contact. And give the volunteers a good leader. You always want to lead by example. And this is in the workplace or on the campaign. My first job was at a movie theater, and I did the dirtiest things like cleaning poppers. It's not a fun task, but when they promoted me to supervisor, I made sure that my other staff members knew that I would do that task before they had to do it. And so as a campaign manager on a campaign, I would do the things I didn't like. I don't personally like phone banking, but I would sit and I would phone bank with volunteers. I'm not a fan of taking out the trash, but I would show volunteers that no task was too menial for somebody in the campaign to do. And leading by example is really an important thing that can show the volunteers just how important even, like I said, the most mundane tasks can be. And things to remember. Don't take your base for granted. If you're a conservative candidate, you're going to have a natural base with homeschool communities, with potential church groups, with other civic organizations, whereas oftentimes on the left they're connected to unions and other organizations like that. But don't take them for granted. Reach out to them. They're not just going to join your campaign on a whim. They have to be asked. Understand their motivations. If it's school credit, if it's, they want to get that letter of recommendation to go to college, you have to understand those motivations. Maybe they just like working on campaigns because they want to be the next Karl Rove. Understand what that motivation is and sort of channel their experience toward that motivation. It'll keep them coming back and keep them engaged in your campaign. Treat them right. Occasionally it'll get rowdy in a campaign office. People will be excited about the candidate. They'll be shouting and horseplay. You want to make sure that you keep that locked down. People can have fun, but they need to make sure they're focused on their task at hand. You also, if you're a campaign staffer or the candidate, I can't stress enough how a meaningful connection can really improve that volunteer's experience. And if something happens and they're made uncomfortable in the office, they won't come back, and you've lost that volunteer. You've lost hours and hours of volunteer work. You want to create activities that motivate volunteers. If our volunteers finish their phone lists by 8 o'clock or by 9 o'clock, we would take them out for ice cream or for frozen custard. It was one of those, like, if you do this, you achieve this goal. If you make 250 calls, we'll go out or we'll see a movie or we'll relax for a little bit. It's one of those things where the campaign can be heated. There's a lot of work to be done, but you want to make sure you have time to relax and to have fun. And your volunteers have to be friendly. As I described with closet cases, they're not necessarily the best folks to put in front of voters. They should be friendly. Everyone should be excited to be there. They should be in good spirits, and it sort of motivates the campaign. It propels the campaign toward victory. If you're working on a losing campaign and the campaign staff is always sour and they're always negative, it's really going to motivate people to stay away. Volunteers will not come and work on what they suspect is a losing campaign. So make sure that spirits are high, that volunteers are friendly, and that your interactions are well received and welcome. And I guess at that point, if
We've got a few questions.
Got a few questions.
Yeah, absolutely. This person lives in a very rural area, and it's difficult for volunteers to get to the office all the time. What are some solutions for people who live in a sparsely populated area?
Sure. And in this instance, things like door-to-door would be very difficult. You know, it's often the candidate and the driver driving from farmhouse to farmhouse in, you know, rural Montana or something. Depending upon the level of engagement in the campaign, you know, major campaigns, congressional campaigns and Senate races have oftentimes have a way where you can plug in online and make phone calls from your home. If you're in a campaign that allows that, certainly harness that energy. We didn't let call sheets walk out of the office in 2010. It was a smaller race. You know, people could get the calls done in the office. But you know, there are ways to get folks involved. Maybe have them attend civic organizations. It would definitely not behoove them probably to go door to door or to always make it into the office.
That's really good advice. Another thing that I heard from someone when I was teaching at a grassroots training is it's often hard to find volunteers when you live in a rural area. And someone brilliantly said the best place to go to find volunteers is at your local dump. Because everyone has to get rid of their trash. And instead of door to door, they went and signed people up. They helped them carry trash from their car to the dump, and it was an interesting idea and certainly clever, and it worked for that campaign.
Sure. There's no shortage of opportunities to connect with other people and bring them into the campaign. If it's as unique as going to the dump and helping them with trash in a rural community, or reaching out to homeschoolers, or whatever it happens to be, you know, anybody who supports your campaign is a potential volunteer. Plug them in any way you can. Just, you know, it's great to be able to reach out to folks in unique places like the dump.
I know that's where I want to spend my spare time when I volunteer. This is a great question. We always talk about phone calls, door to door, and stuffing envelopes. What are 3 tasks that you can have volunteers do that don't have anything to do with phones, doors, or envelopes?
You know, I've got one particularly hilarious and fun task that we did in the 2010 cycle. The major holiday before November election is Halloween. And we devised these little orange strips of paper that explained our opponent's horrendous record on taxes. And the headline was Tax or Treat. And it was a lit drop, sort of like door to door, but it was much more fun. We had an individual who was dressed as the Grim Reaper. You know, volunteer created videos. You know, as we move toward online campaigns and increased use of social media, volunteers can use their talents maybe to create a video that you post on Facebook or on YouTube. I know toward the end of the campaign, we had a bunch of volunteers who wanted to just say why they supported our candidate in a 30-second video that we compiled and put online, and they were able to share that way. So that's a lot of fun. It's not your door-to-door. It's not your phone banking. Sign waving is a lot of fun. You know, you wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning and you head to a crowded intersection, and the positive feedback from drivers honking the horn is exciting to a lot of people. I like sign waving. It's not necessarily the most effective way to reach voters, but it is a lot of fun. And if you've got a lot of volunteers, you can harness their energy that way.
That's great. And we have one last question. And I like to ask this of people. What motivates you to volunteer? Because you're not just a paid campaign staffer. You obviously volunteer your time. What motivates you, and what are the tasks that you like to do?
Sure. You know, the candidate's stance on the issues really is what motivates me. I participate in the political process. I consider myself a member of a certain political party, but it's really the candidate I connect with. I really love to be able to sit down with a candidate or the staff and understand why that candidate is running for office. I love to be able to make that connection. So understanding a candidate and really learning more about that individual's personal life and what motivated them to run is really a motivating factor for me. I absolutely love going door to door, and I love events. So anytime there are public events where a candidate shows up, or door to door opportunities that put me in front of other voters, is really an exciting thing for me. I love meeting new people, talking to strangers, and going door to door and visiting folks at events.
Actually, we do have one more question. If you're a college student, what advice would you give a college student when they're volunteering on a campaign for possibly the first time?
Advice for a college student. Get to know, start locally. My first few campaigns were county commission races, they were state house races, they were hyper local. And that ensures that you are directly connected with a candidate. You're going to see that candidate probably every time you volunteer because it's such a local campaign. So I would say start small. It was discouraging for me in one of my first campaign experiences. It was a Senate race in Tennessee, and all I did was data entry all day long. I never met the candidate. The volunteer coordinators weren't all that friendly, and it was really sort of demotivating for me. I wasn't excited to go into the office. But on a local race, a state house race or a state Senate race or a House of Delegates race, you really get to know the candidate's family, and the other folks who are volunteering. So I would say start locally.
Fantastic advice. Well, Matt, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for the insight on the topic. We learned a lot tonight, and I hope that everybody at home will use this election cycle and election cycles in the future. And thank you for joining us and asking great questions throughout the webinar. As a reminder, tonight's broadcast was recorded and will be available on LI's website. Hope to see you then. Have a great night.